Well, I have 10:30, so thank you for being here promptly, punctually on time. I want to welcome you and welcome those of you who are watching this via Zoom. I understand we have somewhere around 160 that are participating in this event, so by far the majority are on the Zoom, so thank you for joining us. By way of introduction, my name is David Clapp. I was your 2020 RASM president. That's all right. I am also the managing broker for RE/MAX Alliance Group. But more importantly, for perspective on this class, both Julie and I have been involved with the state level in the preparation and the modification and the changes of this contract, both of us over at least the last 10 years. So we have been intimately involved with these changes and helping write a lot of the changes and go through them. This contract, it's been over 4 years since we've made any kind of major modification to it. We typically do it every 2 to 3 years. The version that we've been using prior to November 1st has been around since April of 17, with one minor tweak, but it had not been revised since that time. There have been numerous changes that were considered as a committee over the more than 4 years in between the version changes. Numerous changes that have been suggested by members of Florida Realtors, numerous changes that have been suggested by members of the committee. I can tell you that the committee has spent hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds of hours, over 50 meetings involved in getting us to the point that we are at today. This FAR contract has been around for more than 50 years. And the longevity of this contract is a testament to the fact that it is birthed by a joint venture between realtors and attorneys. And because of that perspective and that interaction of both realtors and attorneys, it is the favored contract throughout the state. As a matter of fact, we've recently, in the last several years, had some appellate court cases that have gone higher up than lower courts. And in one of those cases, the judge, speaking very favorably of the FAR contract, said this: "The form reflects a wealth of experience with both success and failed transactions among professional realtors and real estate attorneys." And so it is to that end that we continue to refine this contract, making it better and better every time we do a revision. Please keep in mind that this contract is designed to be fair and balanced to both buyers and sellers. And whenever we see that there has been an inequity to one side or the other, we work to modify the contract in the next version to take away that inequity. And we will see some of that in the revisions that we go through today. This contract is dated October of 2021, even though it was published for your use on November 1st. So it is available as of now. The changes that we're going to talk about are changes to both the standard version of the contract and the as-is version of the contract, although we are going through the standard version in our discussion today. Some of the changes that have been made are clarifications. We found that something that we had written in the last version of the contract was not clear. And so we have clarified it and made it more clear in this version of the contract. Others are just outright changes. They are changes conceptually to things that are in the contract. And we'll see that as we go through. There are roughly 23 changes that we are going to look at this morning. We are not going to look at housekeeping type changes where we change font or we change lines or we unbolded or uncapped something. We're not looking at those type of changes. We're looking at the changes that have some type of substance to them that can affect you and the way you do business. In addition to the 23 changes to the body of the contract itself, there are there are 7 riders that have been updated or modified, And there are 3 brand new riders that have never existed before this version of the contract. In your handout, we have provided to you both what we call the black line or the clean version, which is at the top. The clean version is exactly how it appears in the new version of the contract, with the exception that I've highlighted a couple key things in the black or the clean version just to point out some of the changes. Those highlights obviously are not there in the contract. And then we provided to you the red line version. Now, red line is kind of in quotes here because the type you're going to find is sometimes blue, sometimes green, and sometimes red. Don't be thrown off by that. This I copied and pasted from a PDF that was supplied, and in some cases the PDF had blue, some was green, some was red, and so you've got kind of a smorgasbord of colors, but it is quote unquote the red line version of the contract. So with that, let me just also say that we will hold questions until the end of the material has been presented. If we take questions like as we go through each section, we'll be here till about 3 o'clock, and neither you or I want that to happen. So if you have a question, I know that the burning need is, I got to get it answered now. So you jump up, raise your hand or whatever. We're not trying to ignore you. Please understand. Put a star next to that or make a note someplace so you can come back to it at the end. We will have some time for questions, but there is a lot of material that we have to get through, and it's more important that we get through the material. And any of your questions that don't get answered, Julie and I will stay afterwards to make sure that you do get those questions answered. So with that, let's move on to the first change that's in the contract. And that first change comes under the personal property, which is on page 1 of the contract, and it's the first one that you have identified there. Personal property has always had a list of items that are included, personal property that's included in the sale. And each version of the contract, we tweak them some. There have been a lot of issues with Ring doorbells and Nest thermostats, where people have taken them. Well, we couldn't put in the contract a specific brand type. We couldn't say Ring doorbells because there are a number of internet-based doorbells. And so we just had to leave it at doorbells and leave it at thermostats. But we've specifically called them out because of the newer versions of those devices. Television wall mounts and television mounting hardware. This is constantly a question that we've been getting over the years. Are the TVs that are mounted, are they included because they're attached? Well, we have now clarified that in the new contract. We don't automatically include the TVs because the TVs can be removed easily. But the mounting bracket and the hardware that mounts to the back of the TV, that mounts the TV to the hardware itself, that's now included. Mailbox keys. We've expanded storm shutters to include storm protection items because not only are there shutters today, but there's fabric and there's other type of devices, roll down devices that may not be considered by some people as shutters. And so we wanted to expand that definition to include a little bit more. So it is storm protection items and hardware. We did delete intercom because intercom doesn't seem to be quite that popular these days. And any intercoms of old days are built in, well built in. They most likely don't work anymore anyways. So we've deleted that from the list. So with that, Julie's coming, and we are going to, throughout the morning, trade off on the different items and allow Julie to introduce herself and then do her next one.
I'll let you keep control of the PowerPoint.
I'll do the
Okay.
clicker.
Okay. Hi, my name is Julie Horskamp. I'm a board certified real estate attorney. I started way back in 1976, fresh out of high school, working for Chelsea Title in Bethesda, Maryland as the receptionist. And then 20 years, I was a real estate closer. Then I went to law school and became a real estate attorney. Thought I'd stay in the same field. And I've been an attorney since 1998. I was at Kirk Pinkerton, a shareholder there for 12 years, not a shareholder for 12, 7 of those 12. And then I went to Berlin Patton when the real estate market crashed to do short sales. Ugh. And then I opened up my own firm in Venice in 2016. So I'm a sole practitioner, but I have notary seal, will travel. So I basically just specialize in real estate closings. So with that said, oh, and the committee. FAR Bar Committee, how could I forget that? I got on the FAR Bar Committee back when I was at Kirk Pinkerton in 2008. So I've been on the FAR Bar Committee since 2008. In fact, when I got on was when they were going through the exercise of thinking about combining the Florida Association of Realtors contract with the FAR Bar contract. Needless to say, that didn't go through, but with all that work that we spent in creating this joint contract, that ended up being the FAR Bar contract. So it went from a 4-page to a 12-page or 11-page, depending on which one. So with that said, I'm going to start my section, closing date. Now, I have noticed already with the new contracts coming in, where is closing date? It's on the top of the 2nd page. I'm so used to it being on the 1st page. And so is my staff, because when they went to do the deadline sheet, where is the closing date? It's at the top of the 2nd page. And the change to the closing date, as David was pointing out, some are changes, some are clarifications. This is really a clarification to basically address those calls that the hotline gets where the seller is insisting that basically closing doesn't happen until seller gets his money in his account. Well, this is trying to address that. I think we've pretty much accomplished that by the language we've added in there. So closing doesn't happen until all the funds are received by the closing agent and all the documents. That's when closing. It doesn't mean that seller has to receive their money in their account before the keys are given to the buyer. So that's what we were addressing, those questions that came in. One thing, it's not in here and it's not in this presentation, but I do want to mention it because I come across this as an attorney. I'll do an addendum to contracts. We're running in a lot of times where buyers are getting financing and then it's a mail away to the buyer. Under the lending regulations, they can't pre-sign, so they have to sign on the closing date. Well, the problem with that is if they're in Maryland, let's say, I don't have the documents on the day of closing. So I've created an addendum where I come up with like, either we switch the closing date to the day before, this fictitious closing date, to the day before, and then basically disbursement date is the original closing date, or I use the closing date, leave it the same, and then make a disbursement date the next day when I receive all the documents. So that's not in the new contract. We've talked about coming up with maybe a rider for that situation, but not yet. Okay, David.
Thanks, Julie. While it was there in the previous version of the contract that documents would need to be there on the day of closing, what Julie just referenced on the mail away, if the documents are not back, buyer's technically in default. So you need to make sure the buyer signs. And we have done this on a number of occasions where we've said to the lender, you need to date the mortgage and note the day before the date of closing in the contract, and have the buyer in a mail away sign them the day before and then overnight them back so that they are in the closing company's possession on the day of closing. Sometimes the lenders don't want to do that. So you'd have to check with them, but that is a way to get around that. Moving on to the next one, extension of the closing date. There are certain things in the contract that automatically extend the closing date. When in April of 17, when the last contract came out, it was being written right when the CFPB new guidelines were just coming out. And part of those new guidelines was that there was a 3-day requirement that a buyer needed to see the CD, the closing disbursement, the old HUD-1, which was renamed, they needed to see that a minimum of 3 days in advance of the closing. And if they hadn't seen it, then you couldn't close. Well, in contemplating that, we said we don't want buyers to be in default. And so we put in this provision that allowed for the automatic extension of the closing if the CD had not been delivered in a timely fashion. Well, what we have found over the last 4 years, in most cases, lenders have gotten the CD out in plenty of time. But there were some cases where the CD wasn't gotten out, but the reason the CD wasn't gotten out is because they didn't have loan approval or it was still in underwriting. Well, that was never the intent of this extension. It was never put there to give an automatic extension of the loan approval period. But that's how people were using it. And we heard of stories where agents would come back to the listing agent and say, well, the CD wasn't issued, we get an automatic 10-day extension. Well, that wasn't the case either. But they didn't have their loan approval and they were grasping at straws so that the buyer would not be in default when they didn't close. So that was not the original intent of that language. And so this is a clarification where we have now added the verbiage that says very clearly that this does not apply unless loan approval has been obtained and it's been through underwriting. Now, we also changed the 10 to a 7. So instead of having up to 10 days, you have up to 7 days, because we found 10 days was way too long and was not needed. So that takes care of that. Moving on to 6B and occupancy. Any of you that have been to contracts class with Julie and I, or just myself, we talk about 6B where there is occupancy after closing, and have often said that in our marketplace, the area of seasonal short-term rentals really was not addressed by this paragraph. When the old contract came out in April of 17, Airbnbs, VRBOs were not really anything that we knew about or had heard about at that time. Since that old contract had come out, we've got lots of VRBOs and Airbnbs, and we have rentals and obligations of sellers that they have entered into agreements to lease their property on a short-term or seasonal basis. And so there was a need to modify the contract and to address. And so now we have, in addition to just the leases, any occupancy agreements, which would include seasonal rentals and short-term vacation rentals. So the new language is specific to cover that. Now, we also have a rider, which we're going to talk about later on, that talks about what can happen and what a seller can do if there are seasonal and short-term vacation rentals in place. The other change that's in this paragraph is the last bullet point there. Under the old version of the contract, tenants needed to provide estoppel letters to the new buyer. The estoppel letter telling what the rent was, security deposit, all that kind of stuff, the term of the lease, and stopping them from taking any kind of action if the terms were different than what were disclosed. Well, we've carved out, you're not going to get estoppel letters from all these seasonal and short-term vacation rental people. And so we have now carved out that estoppel letters are not required under that scenario. So that's also a really good change. Julie?
I got to make sure I don't fall when I get up. I just got my bone density results.
Uh-oh.
So, and I shouldn't be drinking caffeine. Assignability. There was no default in the prior contract. Usually we go through the whole contract trying to have a default so that if you forget to check a box or fill in a blank, that there's a default. Well, this one did not have, prior to this new one coming out, a default. And under Florida law, if the contract is silent, meaning it doesn't address signability, then it's freely assignable. So we addressed that issue with not having the default, and now we have a default. So if you fail to check a box, then it is not assignable. So it kind of goes against the Florida law that if it was silent, because now we're saying it's not silent, it means you can't assign it. And I do want to bring up again, I don't want to deviate from the revisions, but I do want to bring up a point somebody had where it has may assign but not release from liability. A lot of times you're going to see the listing agent wanting that checked if a buyer is buying an entity. And the reason behind that, they want the buyer's name to be the individual so that they can go after the individual, not this entity, because they don't know the assets of the entity. They might know the assets of the individual. So you might get that requirement. So I just wanted to bring that up while we're on that section. The next one. Okay, 8A. And it's funny, when I was going over this with David, I said to him, I said, I'm afraid with all this language being crossed out, you're going to get the wrong impression of why we were making this change. The language you see that we're taking out is about the extension of the closing date and about the terms of the financing, that there's no financing contingency to buyer's obligation to close. What this doesn't mean by taking this language out, and then when I was watching the webinar from Florida Realtors, I understand they're already getting calls about this. This does not mean cash is cash, okay? So this just means, like it meant before, it's not contingent on financing, but it does not mean because we took that language out that a buyer can't still get financing. Basically, a buyer still can get financing even though 8A is checked. They just don't get the benefit of the financing contingency in the quote property related conditions. So that is the big takeaway on this, even though it's a clarification, because we felt the language that was in 8A that's crossed out was unnecessary because it's in other provisions. I just want to make sure that's the takeaway. It's not because cash is cash.
You want to talk about 18L? Access, right of access to do appraisal?
No, I'll get to that later.
Okay. So as we move into financing, 8B, we affectionately refer to this clause on the committee as the F clause. The F clause is the finance clause, not anything else. The F clause is the provision of the contract that is the most debated provision every single time we do a revision, every time. And it was in this case too, literally hours and hours and hours, multiple meetings, revising this, changing it, revising again, changing it, revising again. I kid you not, I have a huge stack of revisions to this provision. What we ended up with, I really like, and I hope you do too. So these changes include tasks that need to be accomplished during the loan approval period. There are now multiple components to loan approval. The appraisal includes valuations that could deviate from your standard appraisal. Notices related to loan approval and the impact of not giving notices. And then add seller access to property related conditions. And we're going to see why that is as we go through them. So we're going to actually go through each of the subsections and look at them individually so that we get an idea of what's going on. The first one is what needs to be accomplished within the loan approval period. Now, you'll notice that first sentence is not new, even though it's in red. It's just been relocated from lower in the paragraph. The older version had it as well. We just moved it up to the beginning, so that's in red. But what is new is you've got point number 1. So during the loan approval period, there are 2 things that need to be accomplished. where before, during the loan approval period, it was only one, it was financing. So now we have numbered that there are two things that need to be accomplished. Number one is the financing, and that's not really changed much. We debated, do we keep that in or not keep that in? But one of the deciding factors is, again, we've had two recent appellate court cases in the last several years. And one of those appellate court cases, the judge cited that the buyer really was in default because they didn't follow the terms of the financing. The contract had specified specific finance terms, and they deviated from that and applied for a mortgage totally outside of the terms of what was in the contract. And so one of the takeaways is that whatever is here in financing that's the loan that you need to be applying for. And if you can't get approval and you applied for a loan outside of those terms, you're in default of the contract. So when you deviate from whatever is specified in the terms for financing, you need to do an amendment to the contract and amend that so that if you get turned down, all the parties were in agreement that whatever it was that you applied for was the loan and the terms of the loan. So don't just willy-nilly go off and get some other type of loan. Now, obviously, if it goes to closing, nobody's really going to care. But where it cares or people care is when they get turned down and they find out we got turned down for something that was other than what's in the contract version of the terms. So that's defined as financing. And you're going to see that in this paragraph B, there are three defined terms. The first one was that of loan approval period. That's the time frame that you've got, and the default is 30 days. The second one is financing, and that's what we just talked about, the terms of the financing. And the third, or the second, that's actually the third defined term, is appraisal. And appraisal was never defined in the old contract, but it is now defined in the new version of the contract, and it is the appraisal or an alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender if either is required by the lender. So in some cases, it's not required by the lender. It just came out in Realtor News from Florida Realtors, an article that Fannie and Freddie are now in 2022 going to desktop appraisals. That means somebody doesn't have to physically go out and inspect the property. They can do it from an office. They did that temporarily under COVID, but now they're making it permanent for 2022. So the actual appraisal, as we have known it with somebody physically going out and doing the appraisal, is not going to be required on a lot of Fannie and Freddie Mac loans anymore. And so the contract now contemplated, we didn't know that change was going to be made permanent, but we contemplated alternative valuation methods, and they are reflected in here. So we see that reiterated in the next slide. You have appraisal and alternative valuations because some lenders don't require appraisals, and some lenders for some loans will accept a different valuation product. And now we see specifically with Fannie and Freddie changing that. Definition of loan approval. This would be the fourth definition. We just looked at three, and now we're defining loan approval. And loan approval is referring us back to the two things that needed to be accomplished in the loan approval period. And that was financing and appraisal. So under the current version of the contract, you do not have loan approval unless you have the appraisal done during that loan approval period. I'm excited about this change, and you should be too, because how many times have you gotten loan approval only to get right before closing and you didn't have the appraisal, and now you get the appraisal and it comes back insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval, and the transaction dies right before closing? Well, that should happen. And again, this goes back to this fairness and balance thing of what's fair and balanced to both buyer and seller. So they, the buyer, need to get, during the loan approval period, they need to get a loan approval, and that loan approval includes both the financing being approved and a satisfactory appraisal or alternative valuation that is satisfactory and sufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. We kept the term sufficient, that's back in the last one, sufficient as opposed to sale price. The appraisal doesn't have to appraise for the sale price. It only has to appraise sufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. That's in the previous paragraph that we had looked at. Okay, Julie.
Okay, we're at 8B2. This is a new change. It's not a clarification, it's a new change. You'll see where it says buyers shall, upon written request, keep the seller and broker fully informed. So the seller has to send a written request to get the information or the status. Also, you're going to see it also includes, it says, basically buyers shall, upon written request, keep seller and broker fully informed about the status of buyer's mortgage loan application, loan processing, appraisal, and loan approval, including any, this is a key thing, any property related conditions of the loan approval. And I guess this was another thing that was added because of the calls coming into the hotline, that the seller wanted to be kept apprised of property related conditions. And you'll see later on, I think I cover 8B6 now, used to be 7, when I talk about property related conditions in more detail there. So stay tuned for that part. 8B3. If within the loan approval period, buyer obtains loan approval, buyer shall notify seller of same in writing prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. And this is a key thing here, a new change. Or if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval, but buyer is satisfied with buyer's ability to obtain loan approval and proceed to closing, buyer shall deliver written notice to seller confirming same prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. So this means basically buyer can still notify the seller if they feel that the appraisal is going to come in okay and that they're going to be able to close and they have the financing that they had applied for, they can notify the seller. And the reason why this is also important is because the appraisal, and I'll be honest, I was one that didn't vote for the appraisal during the loan approval period because I just think that might be a little difficult, but I'm outnumbered there. Okay. So just in case they don't have the appraisal completed in time for the loan approval period expiration, buyer can still give notice to seller and get the benefit of the property related conditions except for the appraisal. So that gives them some protection. So that's why we added that language in there. Let's see if there's anything else I need to do. Nope, that's it.
So going to the next paragraph, 8B4. We've added something new here. Never before was this an opportunity. For the buyer to terminate the contract if the buyer can't timely meet terms of loan approval. So let's put this into a perspective. Under the last provision that Julie covered, the buyer only has to give notice within the loan approval period. Under the prior version of the contract, when the buyer got loan approval, they needed to promptly deliver notice. Now, how is that different? Because here, under this version of the contract, they don't have to promptly deliver notice. They just have to deliver notice within the loan approval period, the 30 days. Well, that dovetails with this, because if during that 30-day period of time, the buyer is uncomfortable with some conditions that may be on that loan approval, then they can give notice of termination. So think about this. Under the previous version, on day 15 of the loan approval period, the lender says you're approved, but they gave conditions. And let me be clear, every loan approval is a conditional loan approval. You don't have an unconditional loan approval until you get a clear to close, which is right before closing. So every loan approval is a conditional loan approval. But in this particular example that I'm using, on day 15, lender says you're approved. Under the old contract, they needed to promptly tell you that they were approved. Under the new contract, they get approved on day 15. They can wait until the end because there's a condition that says you need to pay off this loan of $15,000. Now, can the buyer pay off that loan? Well, if they say yes, because they have a family member that says, hey, no problem, we'll give you the $15,000 to pay off the loan. So they feel comfortable that, hey, we're okay. We're going to be able to pay it off. We'll be able to move forward and close. But on day 28, the family member has an emergency, a crisis, and says, we can't give you the $15,000 to pay off that loan now. Now there is a condition of that loan approval the buyer is not going to be able to meet. Under the old version of the contract, they had to promptly deliver notice of loan approval on day 15. And conditions were not an escape. Under the exceptions, conditions were not listed, so they could not get out. Under the scenario I just gave you, if they didn't close, they would have lost their money. Under the new version of the contract that we're looking at now, they don't have to promptly deliver notice. They can deliver notice as long as it's by the end of the loan approval period, which is a full 30 days. And if they can't meet some of the conditions of the loan approval, they have the right to give notice of termination. That never existed in the old contract. And I know you got a question, but I got to hold it. So I know. So let me just keep giving you some examples, and hopefully we'll answer some of those questions. So essentially, here's what's happening under the new version. Buyer, you've got 30 days to figure it out. And if in that 30 days, you're not comfortable, even if you got loan approval, you're not comfortable that you can meet the conditions of that loan approval, you can give notice to terminate and get your money back. Or in that 30-day loan approval period, you don't get it. The lender doesn't give you loan approval. They say, well, we don't have it yet. And you're able to terminate under either of those scenarios. Don't have it, but don't feel comfortable with the conditions. Either way, I can terminate as long as I'm not in default of any other provision of the contract, and I'm able to get my money back. So they don't end up losing their deposit as they would have under the old scenario. So we move on to the next provision. Now, if the buyer fails to timely deliver notice, and what we're talking about here is notice that, hey, I got my loan approval, or I didn't get my loan approval, but I feel comfortable that I can move forward and get the loan approval. If they don't deliver either of those notices, then the buyer is going to proceed with the contract as if 8A was checked as of the effective date. Now, this is significant. Under the old contract, we said loan approval would be deemed to be waived. One of the appellate court judges didn't like the word deemed, So we got rid of deemed out of this version of the contract. Under the old contract, they would be deemed to have waived the loan approval and they would be required to move forward, but they still would have had the protections of the finance provision, the finance clause. Under this version of the contract, if they don't give either notice, then it is considered that 8A has been checked. And we already saw 8A, it says this contract is not contingent on financing, period. So they get no protections under 8B, the finance provision. They can still move forward and close and not lose their money. But if they don't close, it is considered a cash transaction. And if they don't close, they lose their money. That's a significant change as well. Six.
Which used to be 7. I think we all know it as 8B7. So now it's 8B6. If you can look at that language, because I want to make sure that you focus on there on 8B6. If buyer has timely provided either written notice, the either written notice is, remember, 1 under 8B3, either they got a loan approval, or 2, they're satisfied that they're going to get loan approval. But either way, they have to give written notice to the seller under one of those 2 options to be protected under 8B7. If they stay silent, like David just said, it's 8A cash. They lose their deposit if they don't close. So that's something to make sure that they give notice, either that they got their loan approval or they're satisfied with it, or try to get an extension of the loan approval period is always available too. The thing that I come across a lot is look at number 2 about property related conditions. It says property related conditions of the loan approval, but notice in quotations there, specifically excluding the appraisal valuation, have not been met unless such conditions are waived by other provisions of the contract, like as is, and basically something like that. My only concern with property related conditions, one, remember back in the prior paragraph, we said that seller can request in writing to be apprised of the status of the loan processing and also the property related conditions. And buyer has to keep the seller informed. As a real estate attorney and closing agent, I can't tell you how many times I get calls or emails, usually emails, from the lender wanting to see the road maintenance agreement, wanting to know who pays for the road maintenance. In fact, I was so pissed the last time I just inundated them with all the restrictions, because it's actually a lot of times they're even in a what we call the community development district or an improvement district where the roads are part of the infrastructure and is paid in with the tax bills. I get them all the time, but you know, the buyer is not aware of this. The buyer doesn't know the underwriter is asking for a proof that the roads are paid for and maintained. And so I don't know how a buyer can keep the seller apprised if the buyer is not even aware. So that's just my only concern there with the property related conditions. But the question is that an appraisal item or is that a property related condition? Because remember, property related conditions excludes the appraisal valuation. Now, of course, like a condo reserve, something like that, definitely property condition. Okay, you ready to go to the next section, leave financing?
There's just one thing that I want to give agents as an FYI to make sure that you're doing. Julie covered it when we talked in the previous paragraph about what you can give written notice and request of the buyer. And one of them is the property related conditions. You see in this paragraph here that there's only 2 reasons the buyer gets their money back if they don't close under the finance provision. One is seller default and the second is property related conditions. It used to be that the appraisal could take us right up to closing and then torpedo it. Now the appraisal can't, but property-related conditions still can. So you, if you're a listing agent, you want to be asking, when you get loan approval, are there any property-related conditions? And you should put that in writing, because if there are property-related conditions to that loan approval, they still can have a negative impact in your property not closing. So you need to ask for them up front. Julie,
If they're in there.
if there are any in there.
Well, I mean, there could be property related conditions, but not part of that quote loan approval,
Right.
something the
So you need
underwriter
to know.
looks at. So it's an area, yeah. Okay, you ready to leave the financing
Yep.
clause?
Let's leave financing and go to,
Seller's cost. This was a new thing added in here because we were hearing that when you have a foreign seller, there's paperwork required with the FERPTA withholding. Who pays for that? Is it fair that the buyer has to pay because they got a foreign seller? So we thought not, and we put that charges for FERPTA withholding and reporting is a seller cost. And I want to bring this to everyone's attention too. When you have a foreign seller, it's important that they reach out, the foreign seller reaches out to somebody that's qualified and familiar with FERPTA withholding. I can't tell you how many times I hear that the seller has an accounting firm that's handling the FERPTA. And then the accounting firm reaches out to me as a closing agent and needs my ITIN. Why do you need my ITIN, the closing agent? Because you're the withholding agent. Well, that tells me right there, they don't know FERPTA. The buyer's social security number is what we need for the withholding agent, not the closing agents. So that kind of gives me some angst because then I know the paperwork. Imagine what the paperwork's going to look like that comes in that they prepare. So I think it's really good if you have a foreign seller is to put them in touch with somebody. And it's a plug for Renee Glendenning, but she knows her FERPTA stuff. When I know that Kirkring Barbario is involved, I know I don't have to worry as much. And also, if she's applying for a withholding certificate, then I know the escrow agreement, we've already worked it out. I hold the money in my account until they get, and IRS is taking forever, I'll tell you. And I had last year, the IRS wasn't even cashing my FERPTA checks that I sent to them, FERPTA withholding. They are that far behind. So it is really bad. So you want to make sure that you put your foreign seller in touch with somebody that knows FERPTA withholding. And if they ask for the closing agent's ITIN, red flag. They don't know FERPTA. Survey. Oh my gosh. I have been plugging for this. I have fought for this. I have done so many addendums in the past because a lot of times that title evidence paragraph was left blank and buyer was getting financing. 15 days prior to closing, we had to have the survey. That was before the hot real estate market. Now you try to get a survey in that time period, forget it. They're 4 to 5 weeks out. So I basically, and I can tell you, being on the committee, I can tell you why we put that, change that language to put, because it used to be this, that it is now. It used to be the 5 days prior to closing. The thought was when CFPB rules came out, we had no clue what was going to happen or how that was going to play out if you had a survey issue in the timeline for that. So we felt that we needed to know sooner rather than later if there was a survey issue to give us time to address that and comply with the CFPB rules. It turns out that that really wasn't an issue. What was a bigger issue is you leaving that paragraph default blank, and it defaulted to 15 days prior to closing, especially for closing agents. I can tell you, it was very hard to try to get a survey, and the surveyor was not happy with me when I told him, you have 5 days to get the survey, no problem. So basically we added that, so it's 5 days prior to closing. Another good reason for this, when I order a survey, I also send the surveyor the title commitment because I'm not a surveyor, he's the surveyor. So I want him to locate the easements and any private restriction setbacks on that survey so that we can determine whether or not the property is in compliance or in violation, I should say, of any setbacks or encroaching into any easements. So this is definitely a good change. You don't have to worry about filling in any blank. You can, title evidence, I'm okay with the blank there, back in the title evidence now when we're just talking about title, because title doesn't take as long as surveys to get in this current market. David?
So we move on to special assessments. And we made this revision because in the contract previously, we had they could be paid in full. But we've been finding that in some cases, the municipality was not allowing it to be paid in full, or it was structured so it was part of the taxes and couldn't be paid off. And so then technically, was there a default? So we added the language that only would it have to be paid in full if it is allowed by the public body to be paid in full. And if it's not allowed to be paid in full, then whatever can be paid prior to closing would be paid prior to closing, and what would be paid after closing would default to buyer paying it afterwards. Also, to this paragraph, we had to expand the definition. We had CDDs in there. CDDs became popular, I don't know, 15 years ago. Lakewood Ranch was a classic example of a CDD, and the contract originally years ago required special assessments to be paid in full. So many people were required to pay the CDD off. And the CDD is both a bond and an ongoing maintenance, and the bond could have been paid off, but it's paid in the taxes and it's just paid by the buyer in the annual taxes. So we carved out CDDs. But since the time we carved out CDDs, there have been other special tax districts that have popped up. University Park has a recreational district now. So there are many different special tax districts that have been created throughout the state that are different than just CDD. So we have expanded that to include special assessments imposed by special districts pursuant to Florida Statute 189. And so it's now been expanded to include everything. Under the disclosures, a couple simple changes. Under permit disclosure, we added a reference to Florida statute. Under the mold, we put C Rider I, mold inspection. That never was available before, and so there could have been no reference to it, so we've now added that. Under 10D, flood, this is a disclosure about flood insurance, and that whole last paragraph is kind of a commentary a little bit about how National Flood Insurance Program may assess additional fees or just premiums for pre-firm or non-primary structures, or those that a spouse doesn't reside in or reside at least 50%, and that elevation certificates may be required. Well, you may or may not know that as of October 1st, the National Flood Insurance Program has put in a new rating system called 2.0. And under the old National Flood Insurance, it basically only looked at two factors. One is what flood zone was it in, and looking at the high risk zones, either A or V, what was the flood zone, and what's the elevation certificate show for the height of the base, the first floor versus base flood. So you needed an elevation certificate. You needed to know what zone. Under Flood Insurance 2.0, they consider 12 different factors. And in many cases, they don't even require an elevation certificate. So this information in here was really not fully applicable anymore. It was kind of a commentary anyways, but it doesn't apply in many instances. So it was deleted from the contract. Moving on to property inspection. obviously, if you're using an as-is contract, then you have an as-is paragraph that talks about the buyer's right to inspect and right to cancel for any reason. The standard contract lists a number of items that are what we call warranted items, and those the buyer has the right to inspect. And so we expanded. What was in there previously was seawall and dockage. Well, on the dock usually is where the lift is. And so the assumption was that lifts were warranted and included, but it was a gray area. It wasn't clear because it wasn't spelled out. And so we decided to make it clear, not let it be a gray area. So you have seawalls, dockage, watercraft lift. That could be a jet ski lift. That could be a boat lift. That could be an elevator style lift. That could be anything and the related equipment that is used by that lift or for the purposes of lifting a boat out of water. So we've expanded it to include that. Also, we have gone to the repair section and we've added that the general repair items are completed at seller's expense or have the repairs estimated, and then that goes on. So let's talk about what happens here. In a standard contract, buyer does a home inspection. They take from the home inspection the list of items that correlate with the warranted items in the contract, and those that are defective, they put a written notice to the seller that these items are defective. The contract then gives the seller 10 days to go out and get written estimates on repairing those defects. Well, what was happening in practice is the seller would get this list and it had 5 things that were small plumbing things. It had 6 things that were small electrical things. Well, the seller would call out an electrician. The electrician wouldn't make one trip and say, okay, this, and this, here's an estimate of what it's going to cost. The electrician would come out and he'd repair those things and he'd give them a receipt. They'd pay him. Same way with the plumbing. There were so many times that that's what happened. So there was no written estimate delivered. So technically the seller was in default. We've now modified this language so that it allows the seller at seller's expense just to make those repairs. But please note that it's within the 10 days. So within the 10 days, the seller is either going to get a contractor out, licensed, and they're going to do those repairs, give them a receipt, and the seller is going to provide that receipt to the buyer. Or maybe it's something larger, such as a roof, where they'll have a licensed roofer come out and do a written estimate on what it's going to cost to do those repairs. A roofer is not going to generally come out and do the repairs on site. They're going to give you an estimate. Same way with an HVAC system, they're not going to come out and just do it, although they could in that 10-day period. So now within the 10-day period, the seller is either going to have those items repaired or they're going to get written estimates and they're going to deliver those items to the buyer, so that we know, is it in excess of the repair limit or under the repair limit? If it's in excess of the repair limit and the seller already did them, well, the contract provides that if the seller is going to do the repairs in excess of the repair limit, the buyer stays in the contract. So now we have written receipts showing that those repairs, even though they exceeded the repair limit, they've been done. And so the contract moves forward. In today's world, we're finding people putting 0 for the repair limit, which I don't recommend doing, by the way. I'd rather see 250, 500, 1,000, not a 0. 0 doesn't make it an as-is contract. So what's happening is if you're putting 0 or $100, almost anything in the home inspection is going to exceed the repair limit. So the seller's got 10 days now to go out and get written estimates, or in the case of like these little plumbing things, electrical things, they're just going to get them done. This contract now provides seller at seller's expense can just do them. And of course, the only way there would be evidence that they were done is to provide the receipt that it was done. Really?
Time, my favorite subject, time. We do deadline sheets in my office and calendar all the deadlines. In fact, I got to make sure I tell the person that's doing these deadline sheets, we got to change here, because what we used to do, if the deadline fell on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, it gets bumped to quote the next business day. So I would tell her that she's got to write next to the deadline 5 p.m. next to that deadline. So that way we know the party would have to give notice by 5 p.m. prior to the expiration of the deadline. Otherwise, it's a calendar day and it's all the way through to midnight. Now we don't have to worry about that anymore. So you'll see, and basically new items we have, time is of the essence, has always been time is of the essence. We just moved it to the front. Calendar days based on where the property is located, because needless to say, the Panhandle's in a different time zone. So that would be come into play if the office is on the East Coast, let's say that the closing agent's office or the buyer or the seller. So it's where the property is located, that time zone. And as far as holidays, if you go to 5 USC section 6103A, this is where technically people were abiding by what we have, the language we have in here now, but technically if you looked at that legal holiday, it didn't necessarily fall in there. And the example they give on the next slide, which I'll go to in a second, is December 25th falls on a Sunday in her instance. This year it falls on a Saturday. I looked. Yeah, Sunday. So can you go back to the prior slide? Okay, the observance of the holiday. So basically it gets bumped to the next day. Like if it fell on a Sunday and the holiday is observed on a Monday, then basically that deadline or the closing date, let's say it was December 25th, it fell on a Sunday, or the closing date was December 26th. Christmas fell on Sunday, it's observed on Monday, December 26th. When is your closing date? 27th. Now, let me throw a little wrinkle in there, and I'm not promoting this. On or before December 26th. And how many times do you see closing date on or before? And am I guilty? Oh, we're being Zoom. This is nice. Yes. If it says on or before, you should not be using that to start off. But if it said on or before, then I don't know necessarily that you would be bumped to Tuesday. I think you would go back to Friday. A reason not to use on or before, because I think that could come back to bite you. Okay.
Did the example already?
I did the example already.
You did it.
Yeah.
Moving on to force majeure. Y'all like force majeure? We had a lot of practice with force majeure when the pandemic hit, but there was still a lot of confusion. So you're going to see some of those adjusted. We've got 3 slides to look at here. And the first one that we changed in force majeure is the seller, buyer or seller not required to exercise or perform any right or obligation. It used to simply say an obligation, but the contract affords buyers and sellers rights that aren't obligations. So in the example below, making a deposit timely is an obligation of the contract. The buyer has an obligation to make sure they make their first and additional deposits in a timely fashion. It's not a right, that's an obligation. Doing a walkthrough inspection is a right that is afforded the buyer in the contract. They don't have to do a walkthrough inspection. Doing a home inspection is a right that is afforded to the buyer in the contract. Many buyers, especially into this market, they waive it. They don't have to do it. If they're paying cash, a survey is a right that the buyer has the right to do. It's not an obligation. And so they don't have to do the survey if they don't want to. So we wanted to make sure that we carved out in force majeure that it prevents the performance of not only obligations, because obligations is a much narrower scope within the framework of the contract. We needed to expand it to include the rights that the parties had, as well as the obligations that the parties had. So while it doesn't seem like a significant change to you, it is a significant change if you were going to argue about something that fell under force majeure and whether it was being able to be delayed because it wasn't an obligation, it was a right, but not an obligation. Now we've corrected that and included both the right and the obligation. The second thing that we corrected in the force majeure provision is we expanded the definition of what's considered a force majeure event. It now includes civil unrest. You'll notice that the last couple of years, we've had a lot of civil unrest. Can you imagine if you were trying to do a closing while they were looting and rioting and firebombing in a city? I mean, that would be a force majeure event. You wouldn't be able to do it. It would disrupt and you wouldn't be able to perform. So we've expanded to include civil unrest or government actions or mandates, government shutdowns, because we've seen some of that too. Epidemics and pandemics, specifically COVID. When COVID hit, there was a lot of questions. Was COVID a force majeure event? Most of us agreed that it was, but there were some that said, no, it's not listed in the list of things that fall under force majeure. So no, it wasn't a force majeure event. And so there was a lot of arguments that went back. This new contract is more inclusionary of different things, and they are spelled out in the definition. The third significant change: when does a force majeure event start? Based on the old language of the contract, it was somewhat ambiguous. Now we have specifically said it is deemed to have begun on the first day the effect of force majeure prevents performance or non-performance or the ability of services, insurance, or required approvals essential to closing. So a hurricane is the classic example. The force majeure event doesn't start the day the hurricane makes landfall. The force majeure event could start when the governor declares a state of emergency. The force majeure event could start for insurance purposes. You have this concept of when the storm is in the box. And that box is pretty broad, but when it gets in there, they suspend insurance. So now we've expanded this to say force majeure begins at this time when parties are prevented from performing or non-performance. That's the beginning. And if you're involved in a transaction, I would specify, I would put the other party on notice that the hurricane is in the box. It's the start of force majeure, and identify that this is the beginning of the event. So all parties to the transaction, buyer, seller, listing, selling agent, are all in tune that here is the start, because it still gives us time periods. We still have to perform 7 days after the force majeure no longer prevents, or we have a 30-day period of time. So we need to establish when the event started so we know the timetables that are involved. So it's important, and this gives us that guidance, which it wasn't there before.
$11:40.
We're doing good.
Okay. Standard 18K. And I've come across this where basically somebody tries to make the argument that if it's said under that prior, I think it was at 9F, if it was checked that seller pays it in full, that seller had to pay when it's not, quote, a CDD, it was a special improvement district. Like David mentioned, Lakewood Ranch, University Park, down in Venice, we have, the West Villages. So there's a lot of different districts out there. And I kind of got an education on this because I was assigned to work on this part of it. and talking to, believe me, I'm not an attorney that's well-versed in this, but I did reach out to attorneys that are well-versed in this subject. And the reason why we added chapter 189, it's kind of like a catch-all. I mean, if you Google this term about special districts, and you got to figure this is a statewide contract. You go down to Miami-Dade, you're going to see a whole list of special districts. That's not, quote, a CDD. And there's numerous statutes that be able to create a special district depending on what type of district. But this attorney was saying that 189 is kind of like a catch-all. They kind of fall underneath the umbrella of 189 if they're not a true CDD, Community Development District, under 190. They fall under 189. So that's why we added that language, 189, so that nobody could make that argument that seller has to pay off the part in the non-ad valorem section about the, I want to call CDD fees, but improvement district fees, because it would be substantial amount for the payoff. And you technically can get a payoff if you had to. Okay, David.
Moving to standard O. We want to specifically talk about notice and how notice can be delivered. It used to be through electronic PDF media. Well, that became confusing because then our text messages, social media is electronic. And so we wanted to clarify and limit it to mail, facsimile, a fax. When's the last time you sent a fax? Okay, but the benefit of a fax, even though many people don't use them today, fax is time-stamped. And when it comes to giving notice and delivery of that notice, there has to be a way to determine the time in which that's done. And so it's limited to mail. You can send mail certified and you know when it is been delivered, you can track it. Facsimile, you've got date stamps on that. Personal delivery, well, you know when you personally delivered it. You may want to get a receipt if you personal deliver. That's not done often, I can assure you. But email is probably the most frequent way that we're going to deliver notice, whether it's notice in regard to a home inspection, notice in regard to cancellation, whatever that notice is, it's going to most likely be done via email. So you cannot do text messages. You can't do social media. You can't do voice message on a phone. Okay, those are not and do not constitute notice under the terms of the new contract. So when we look at paragraph 19, we see that it changed in the standard contract where the red is shown on the screen. They are the 3 new riders. And then there's 7 other riders that have changed. And we'll look at each of these riders in detail and talk about them as we go on. The last change within the contract is there was a section called counteroffer rejection. And basically, it's been revised to counteroffer, and it's a simple statement. You can check the box, seller counters the buyer's offer. There is no obligation of a seller to, in writing, say, I'm rejecting your offer. We, from time to time, will get a selling agent, and this is crazy times that we're living in. We get 8 offers, and if you didn't get your offer accepted, you and your buyer are upset. And so you want to make sure, was my offer presented? And you say, I want the seller to sign and check the box that they rejected. Well, that doesn't happen, and that's not required to happen, and you can't force the seller to do that. And it wasn't being used most of the time anyways. So in this version of the contract, it's not there. It's not there to check that box. The seller rejects the offer. The only thing that is there is a simple box, seller counters the buyer's offer. And sometimes that'll get used and sometimes it won't. We usually mark up the contracts when we counter, and we date those markups and send it back, you could check this box as well. There is a requirement under the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics that if you as a selling agent want to know, was my offer presented to the seller? You have a right to ask of the listing agent, was my offer presented? And please provide me that in written format that you did present my offer and it was rejected. And the listing agent has an obligation under the Code of Ethics to in writing respond to you that your offer was or was not presented. But there is no obligation that comes with the Code of Ethics for the seller to in writing say whether they did or did not accept your offer. So that brings us to the end of the contract and the 23 changes that we are reviewing in the contract. We're going to go through the riders, but if there's any questions on the contract right now, we can field the questions on the contract.
My one question was that if you add the appraisal rider, does that extend the time to closing to get the appraisal done if it's not very long?
Well, it could conflict because the appraisal rider, I think, has a time period. Do you have the appraisal rider with you? Let me check the appraisal rider to see if it has a time period. I
think it does.
think it does. And so a rider would trump the contract. And the question is, should you still use the appraisal rider? Well, the same reasons that you would have used the appraisal rider before still apply. If you want a full price appraisal, not just a sufficient appraisal, then yes, you would use the appraisal rider. And if it's a cash transaction and you wanted to appraise for full sale price, then you would use the appraisal rider in that case too. But if you're a listing agent and you get a contract with an appraisal rider and it has a time period different than the loan approval period, then you as a listing agent should catch that and change it so that it is within the same time period and does not extend it, because we don't want to defeat the whole idea of getting the appraisal done within the loan approval period. Otherwise, you're just dragging it out and could go right up until before closing and find out it doesn't appraise sufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval.
And if you can give me your card, who
Yeah,
asked the question?
Jessica.
Yeah, if you can give me your card, I'll reach out. And
Any other questions on the contract? Julie, we did a great job. There's no questions. That's awesome. So let's move into the riders. So here we have an overview of the 3 new riders: mold, the vacation, seasonal, vacational, and the pace, and then which 7 have been updated, and they are mostly minor updates. So let's go to the first one. The mold inspection is not for the as-is. Why not for the as-is? The as-is contract gives the buyer the right to inspect for anything, including mold. You don't need a mold rider for the buyer to be able to inspect for mold. The as-is contract gives the buyer the right to cancel for any reason whatsoever. So you don't need a mold limit that gives them the right to cancel if it exceeds the mold limit. So in the as-is contract, a mold rider is moot. It has no value, no benefit, no effect. And so there's not even a provision in the as-is contract in paragraph 19 where it lists all the riders. There's not even a provision there for the mold rider because it's not applicable. But under the standard contract, when you look at the list of warranted items in the standard contract, mold is not a listed item. And so if you have a buyer who's sensitive to mold and they don't want to buy a house if there's mold in it, then you need to use this rider. Now, this rider morphed it went through multiple revisions, and I worked on it. I was the one writing all these changes, and I've got probably 12 versions of it. But originally we started off with the idea that we would give the seller the right to correct the mold and keep the buyer in the transaction. That's the way it is under the general repairs. If it exceeds the repair limit, the seller has the right to do them and keep the buyer in the transaction. But what we ended up with after a lot of discussion is that mold is a very sensitive issue to buyers. And so we don't want to put a provision that forces a buyer to move forward with the transaction if they are uncomfortable with it because they're hypersensitive to mold. And even if the seller repairs it, it may not be for them. And so we landed on this version of the mold rider that simply gives the buyer the right to inspect and to cancel. So the key points that are here. When the buyer wants to do mold, we need to use this. They do not want to buy the property if there's mold damage that's found that will cost more than the repair limit. And again, I already said it's for residential. So the buyer must use a professional inspector for mold. It can't be Uncle Ted goes in, says, yeah, there's some black stuff there, there's mold. It's got to be a professional inspector. It's got to be performed within the time period. The time period defaults to 20 days because the standard contract defaults to 15 days for the inspection. We wanted to give 5 additional days. So if you change the inspection period to 10, change the mold to 15 so that there's always 5 additional. Why? Because you generally have to mail away samples or there's a lab test that has to be done, and that takes longer than the typical inspection period. So you want to have a buffer of at least 5 days on top of it. The buyer is required to deliver the mold inspection report if they're going to claim that there's mold and it exceeds the cost. The buyer may cancel by delivering written notice where it exceeds the cap or the dollar amount, which was, what do we put? If left blank, 500. And then if the buyer does not timely conduct the inspection or does not timely exercise the right to cancel, then the contingency is automatically waived and the contract moves forward. So if you're using a mold rider, you need to act within the time periods of the mold rider. The next rider, DD, seasonal vacation rentals. This was designed because, again, we live in a world of VRBO and Airbnb, and there are many properties today that have been bought by investors specifically and are used for Airbnb and VRBO type rentals. They are seasonal rentals. And so they have these rentals in place. There are some properties that are owner occupied that are used occasionally for seasonal rentals, and they have agreements, occupancy agreements in place. So the question was, where this is the case, is the seller going to be allowed to continue to book additional rentals after you go under contract? Yes or no? And so that's the top part, may or may not, after the effective date, enter into additional rentals. And if the answer is yes, that they may, can they do it only with the buyer's approval, or can they do it without the buyer's approval? And you note that it has to be under market rates and terms that they enter into these new agreements. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, look at it from a seller's point of view. The seller rents these on weekly, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a month basis. They enter into an agreement, 30, 60-day closing. And if they have to stop taking additional rentals, what happens now if the buyer defaults and doesn't go to closing? The seller is sat for 60 days, hasn't taken any additional bookings when they could have had additional bookings. From a buyer's perspective, If the buyer is buying this property because it's been a great property for seasonal rentals and they want to continue to use it for seasonal rentals, well, they don't want to have 60 days go by where no additional bookings have been done. And the buyer, can't start to promote it and advertise it because they don't own it. What happens if they don't close and they've booked vacation rentals for a property they don't own? So they can't book them because they don't own them. But yet they want it for this type of investment property. So they want the seller to continue to book seasonal rentals because when they take over, they want them to continue. But in some cases, the buyer goes, no, I'll take the 60-day period without any additional bookings because I'm going to go in and renovate the property. I'm going to make it look so much nicer that when I put it back on the market, I'm going to get more rent for it. So there's lots of different scenarios here, pro and con, for doing this. But under the previous version of the contract, there was no way to have this conversation. There was no way to decide, decide whether the seller could or couldn't, and if they could, with the buyer's approval or without the buyer's approval. So now we've got a rider that allows that to happen. The additional thing is that the last section of that rider talks about if there's a property management agreement in place for seasonal rentals. There are many property managers out there that book vacation and seasonal rentals. And if there's a property management agreement in place, then this rider specifies that a new buyer, the new owner, the buyer, is going to be bound to the terms of that property management agreement. But the new buyer is going to be given a copy of that property management agreement. And if there's something in there that they feel is untenable, that they can't live with, then they have the right to cancel the contract and not move forward. But if they don't cancel the contract based on their review of the property management agreement, then they are bound by the terms of the property management agreement and they will honor it and move forward. Now, once the tenants or the bookings that were done by that property management are done, the new buyer can cancel that agreement and book on their own, but they would have to honor it for the bookings that are already in place. Julie, pace.
Okay, I actually had one back in April. I don't know how many of these PACE liens you come across or closings that had a PACE lien involved, but I had one in April of this year that had a PACE lien. And let me just give you a couple issues that come up and what you have to do. If you look at the tax bill, the non-ad valorem section might have something referring to PACE. That tells you there's a PACE lien. Okay, so one of the places you can go to is the non-ad valorem section of the property tax bill. Can't be a guarantee. You don't see one there, you can't say, oh, we don't have to worry about PACE. You could, depending on what time of the year they got the PACE lien. But there's two things. One, it's going to be in here possibly if it's already set out there. The other thing is when they do a title search, there's what we call a summary memorandum of agreement recorded. Okay. And just so you know, that's recorded and it refers to the property and it turns up in the title search. But the signature is not by the seller, the owner. Okay. So you can't say to the owner, did you sign a summary memorandum of agreement? It's not signed by the seller. It is recorded and is a lien against the property and has super priority, just like property taxes. So it's a definite reason. If you see the second paragraph, it says, in the event buyer is obtaining a mortgage loan to purchase a property, be advised that most mortgage lenders will require the satisfaction or release of the PACE financing from the property. So that is why we just put in the contract, or not the contract, the rider, the disclosure, the required disclosure. So when you take a listing, And they say, oh, we just put in this special HVAC, or we just put in these special windows, and, you know, we didn't have to pay for it up front. That's telling you something there, because sometimes people don't understand it's a PACE lien. If they think it's a good thing, they got to pay with their property taxes, that's telling you it's a PACE lien. And just for instance, on this one that was recorded, repayment terms can be 10 years, 15, 20, whatever's in the memorandum. Worst case scenario in that summary of memorandum is the maximum annual assessment. In this case, it was for a HVAC. You know what the maximum annual assessment? $7,273.69. Interest rate 7.49%. But this is a good thing. So then they come back and record an addendum to that memorandum of agreement when the parties actually fine tune what kind of improvement they're doing and how much they're spending and all that. And that's when the maximum assessment comes down some. Okay, and that maximum assessment is going to come into play because, like in this case, there was the assessment listed in the property tax bill for last year, right in there, listed in there as green corridor PACE. Told me there was a PACE thing. Plus my title search came up with actually 2 recorded summary memorandum of agreements and 2 addendums to those agreements, even though it was one technically PACE improvement that was done. And the reason why it comes into play is because what we have to worry about is the last assessment, the last PACE assessment. Because unfortunately, in the payoff letter that we get from the green provider, the PACE provider, they have language that says that this payoff quote assumes the tax year 2020 special assessment had been paid to the tax collector's office. And it says that there could be another assessment out there. So they're covered under their payoff letter, the provider, they're covered. Closing agent is not, seller's not. So what we have to do in that case is we have to escrow the last assessment amount. And now we can use whatever the maximum assessment is. We can use that amount because that's the most the annual assessment could be. So we can escrow that amount. And then you know how long I had to wait before I could do this? Well, you got 2 things. You could do it with the trim notice came out. I actually put in my escrow agreement that I created for the property tax bill. I wanted to make sure. And sure enough, the property tax bill came out with no PACE assessment, and they recorded the termination of the memorandum of agreement. So we were good to go. I could release my escrow to the seller. But it does mean, depending on the time of the year, that last assessment is the gotcha, and that you have to wait to see, because like I said, the payoff letter, they're covered under that. It all depends on when in the year you close. So like if they had closed in November, then it basically would be for this year, we would know what the assessment was and it would have been included in the payoff, but it depends when they close in the year. So just be aware that you probably will have to escrow. And also, I think it's important, I think I got it on the next slide. Yeah. Listing agents should ask seller if there's PACE financing on the property. And unfortunately, I back when this came out in this area, I mean, this has been in the state for a while now. And because I remember attending Florida bar meetings and them talking about PACE. And I'm thinking, what's PACE? Because we didn't have it in this area. But I think it was a year or 2 years ago, we had a PACE presentation here. And there were people going out, and basically I remember went to the Venice auditorium, and they had a speaker from the county promoting this. And there was, you know, the general public, some real estate agents, I was there, some other closing agents, talking about these, what you can do. And sellers might think it's a good thing because they don't have to worry about pay, they don't have to have the money to pay it up front. But as you can see, it can create major headaches for closing agents. And what happens if that seller doesn't have the money to pay off that assessment? In other words, they're selling it for X amount. And when they're selling it for X amount, that's including the new HVAC. So it's kind of like for a buyer to assume this, they would be double paying on that improvement. They're paying an increased purchase price because it has solar panels, let's say. And they're assuming the PACE assessment. So it's not a good thing for a buyer to assume the PACE assessment. If they're getting financing, it's almost a sure thing. They can't assume the PACE assessment because this lien takes priority over the buyer's mortgage, okay? Because it has super priority, just like property taxes. So you got to make sure the seller is aware that they got to pay off that assessment, not the assessment. They have to pay off the PACE lien and possible escrow for the last assessment, depending on the time of the year. Okay.
Just curious, has anyone in the room had a PACE loan they've dealt with? Anyone? 1, 2, 3, 4? Okay, good. So
You're gonna see more.
starting to see more of them, and you will see more of them. And so this rider will become very important for you to deal with. Homeowner Association rider disclosure. The condominium rider, we talked about making some changes to, but decided not to in light of what happened on the East Coast with the collapse of the condo building and some new regulations that we're sure will be coming out. And so we left the condo rider alone, but we tweaked the HOA rider in a couple ways, and some of them are to bring some things from the condo rider over to the HOA. And so the first one is an example of that. In the condo rider, you need to determine, or you need to disclose, is association approval required of the buyer? Yes, it is, or no, it is not. And so now that's a part of the HOA rider. Probably less done in an HOA, but there are some of the newer HOAs that are very controlling, and they must approve the buyer. So if you're a listing agent, when you list a property, you're going to fill out this HOA rider and make it available. And you should then check, is it or is it not required for approval to be approved to join the HOA. We also modified and clarified under the special assessments that those that were levied and existed as of the effective date, or that were put into place after the effective date, but that were due before closing, they would be required to be paid for by the seller. But if something was paid after closing, then that would still be able to be negotiated, because there is a checkbox that either the seller will pay them off by the time of closing, or if they can be paid in installments after closing, then the buyer would pay them. So that can still be negotiated. This also came over from the condo rider, and that is language that was found there, but not in the HOA, that the seller would pay prior to closing any fines imposed. Fines are more popular in condos, but they exist for sure in HOAs. And so if there's a fine imposed against the property by the association that exists, then it would have to be closed or paid also at closing. And the seller would pay any fees that are associated with either assessments or estoppel letters, for example, of the HOA. That would also be factored in here. The next tweak or modification was to the FHA VA. This particular rider now takes away specific references to a termite inspection or roof inspection, because what we have found is that sometimes the lenders no longer require them. And so why have them pre-printed in the contract? We took the specific reference out to a paragraph. We took the reference out to a termite inspection, a roof inspection, and just put lender required inspections. And again, deleting reference to paragraphs in the contract and referencing it in general, any other provisions of the contract. That way, if things get juggled in the contract and numbers change, we don't have to worry about changing it here. Also, under specific FHA financing, we put in a default amount, $100 if left blank. When we go to the VA section, we did a similar thing. The seller is going to pay all required fees under VA regulations up to, and we put a default of $250. Again, we got rid of specific references to a WDO inspection, tax service, underwriting, documents, document prep fees, those things required by the lender, recording and assignment fees. All those things are specifically mentioned, and many of them have gone away. And so rather than having a reference and suggesting that the lender should charge for them, we just put whatever the lender has under VA regulations, then they would be the things that would be charged. Right to inspect and cancel.
A big change here. We just moved it up to paragraph 2 from paragraph, and did away with paragraph 5. So really no major change on that.
No real change.
Pre-closing, and you'll see the next one, post-closing, similar changes where instead of saying a mutually agreeable written quote lease, we added pre-closing or post-closing, depending on which rider, occupancy agreement or other similar agreement, so that the party can say, no, I demand, there must be a lease. I want a lease. Now, with that said, and this is not neither one of these two are my favorite riders, because it gives that if the parties fail to mutually agree to a pre-closing agreement within the time period stated above, and this one in the pre-closing, and buyer has not taken occupancy, then either party by notice to the other can terminate. Post-closing, on the next one, it says if the parties failed to deliver a mutually acceptable post-closing agreement within the time period stated above, and a lot of times I see it's blank, so that's 10 days prior to closing, then either party can send notice terminating the contract and the deposits refunded to the buyer. So in this hot market, you better be careful on that. You want to make sure that you give notice, come to agreement on a mutually acceptable if you're using this rider. But that's one of the caveats with these riders.
And I would just say, check with your broker or an attorney, because you as an agent cannot draft a pre or post occupancy agreement. We are only, as real estate professionals, able to use the Florida Supreme Court approved lease. So if it's a pre or post occupancy, it's got to be drafted by an attorney. And some of your brokerages have some standard versions of that that can be used that were drafted by an attorney. Sale of the buyer's property. So we used to have an either, they could terminate or waive and move forward. What we did is basically said, it doesn't really need to be an either, just give the buyer the right to terminate. And if they don't terminate, then this rider is of no effect. So instead of an either or, you have to affirmatively give notice to remove. We now made it that you have an obligation. If you want to cancel, you need to deliver written notice of cancellation. And if you fail to deliver written notice of cancellation, this rider and this contingency goes bye-bye. So you have a time period in which to act, and your failure to act becomes the action that removes and makes the contract move forward in full force and effect. Now, understand that if we use rider V, now you've got loan approval, because we looked at the finance clause, and the finance clause does allow you to get loan approval as long as you've added rider V, and that loan approval is conditioned upon the sale of other real estate. But once you go past the 30 days, you don't get to cancel now because of this condition, because of this home sale contingency. And if you fail to act and terminate by the time period in here, and you don't give notice to terminate, then the home sale contingency goes away. And you're expected to move forward to closing. And if you fail to close, you lose your deposit. Okay, so give that notice, be sensitive, watch the time period. And then the second change that we made on the sale of the buyer's property is it used to give a time period in which to deliver if the buyer's property was under contract already, then you could fill in on or before a time period to deliver notice of that contract. Well, we said that's kind of silly. What happens when that doesn't get filled in? So we just changed it to automatically that you're going to, at the time the offer is made, the buyer's going to provide seller with a copy with obviously the third party information, the buyer and the price obliterated, but you're going to deliver it simultaneous with your signed contract. Or if for some reason you can't deliver it simultaneous, then within 24 hours that the buyer makes their offer. I mean, it's really part of the seller's consideration. If the seller's looking at accepting the buyer's offer and the buyer's got it contingent upon the sale of other real estate, then the seller wants to know, is it under contract? Yes, well, I want to see that contract. What's the financing of that contract? What's the time period for inspection? How much deposit money? How strong is this buyer going to be? They want to see the contract. So we can't wait 2, 3, 4, 5 days. It's under contract. Your choice is deliver a copy of the contract with your offer or within 24 hours of your offer. But you got to do it timely and you got to do it immediately so that the seller can make a business decision about whether or not to accept it. So those two changes there. And then the backup contract, Julie?
Backup contract, it was just a minor clarification on that. If you look at the language, it says if any deposits have been paid. It actually was brought to our attention under the backup rider. If you look up above, it says the effective date of this backup contract shall be the date seller delivers written notice of termination of the prior executed contract. Then all the time periods start ticking away. Well, the deposit was due 3 days after effective date. So technically it said, and buyer shall be refunded the deposit. What deposit? Does that mean the buyer has to pay the deposit up front? And so we just wanted to clarify that and say, if any deposits have been paid. So if it was a company's offer, then yes, it would have been paid and buyers refunded the deposit. If it's 3 days after effective date, then it's not there. So that was just a clarification.
So we did that in really good time, an hour and 20 minutes. That's pretty amazing. So that gives you the overview. It does give us some time for questions though. So let's go next to Jessica and then we'll come over here and we'll bounce around a little bit.
Okay, my name's Maggie. I just want to go back to the sale of buyer's property.
Okay.
And
B.
talk about if there's a finance contingency. I just want to clarify what you just said there. So if I have a buyer that's getting a mortgage.
Yeah.
And the offer is going to accept the sale of the buyer's property.
Correct.
And we're beyond we've gone into the 30-day loan approval, and the loan approval comes back contingent upon the sale of the property, and the property doesn't close. Therefore, my loan isn't approved. My deposit is still refunded to the buyer.
Provided they give notice right away within the time period that's in the rider V. So if they give notice, they know, hey, this thing fell through. I can't buy the property. My property fell through. They give notice to the seller. I need to terminate. I can't close. They get their money back. But if they stay silent after that date and they don't give notice of termination, then rider V goes bye-bye. And even though their loan approval has a condition of the sale of their property, and now they can't meet that condition, if they're 30 days, if they're past their loan approval period, then they don't get the right to cancel anymore. If they're still within the 30 days and that falls through and they go, man, we can't do this. I've got this condition on my loan approval and I'm not going to be able to meet it now because my property fell through. They can terminate the contract at that point. They're within their 30-day loan approval period. But once they're past the loan approval period and now they go past the time period in V, yeah, they're going to be stuck. So they need to cancel within that loan approval V, within that period of time. If it doesn't close by that date, then they can terminate the contract within 3 days thereafter. So they got to do it within that time period. Yes, far left, right? What?
Make sure you repeat their questions.
Repeat their questions.
Zoom people can hear it.
So the Zoom people can hear it. Yes, to the far left.
Closing date and closing occur, is it when everyone?
That's all right. That's all right. Go ahead, say your question.
And it's just like, go.
Yeah.
Is closing completed when all the funds are dispersed, or just when the closing occurs? They receive everything from the lender, but they don't have to disperse. I mean, I'm not saying that the seller.
Yeah, that's
So
it. That's
let me repeat the question. So the question is, when the title company has the funds
or attorney.
or the attorney, is that closing or do the funds have to be dispersed in order for closing? Is that your question?
Permission to disperse. And it
Permission.
means that the seller may not have received the money.
Correct.
But if the wire has not been initiated or the check's not been written, whether the seller is receiving a check, just buyer then get keys like, hey, okay.
So does the buyer get keys even though the seller didn't get their money?
But that question, if it's, in other words, waiting on funding approval from the lender, I don't have collected funds yet because I don't have the authority to disperse that money. So my argument being no, under 18S, I don't have collected funds because I'm not authorized to release those funds. I might have received the wire, but I'm not authorized to disperse on that. And we run into that a lot of times when you have a lender that requires funding approval. So no, we don't have.
So yeah, and let's be real clear. The new definition of closing says they need to have collected funds and all the documents. Then you have a closing. So the seller, let's say that closing takes place at 4:30 in the afternoon. They can't wire the funds to the seller till the next day. So on the closing day, you still had a closing. Title company's got collected funds. Seller doesn't have their funds. Buyer gets the keys because closing took place.
If we have funding
Closing's
approval
done.
from the lender.
Yeah, you got the funds. The funds are collected. The loan funds are there. The buyer's funds are there. And that's the reason that we expanded that definition, because there have been disputes. The seller says, if I don't get my money, you're not getting the keys. That's not the case under the terms of this contract. If the title company has the money and they have the documents, closing took place. Now, the title company could give a paper check to the seller if they would accept it, but they go, no, I want them wired. Fine, wire can't be initiated till the next day. Buyer still gets the keys that day.
Yeah, show up for closing to the attorney's office.
Yeah, the old way. So yes, okay.
Okay, the question is on 18F. It's calendar days, and Julie said the time frame is midnight because they crossed out the 5 p.m. Is that correct?
11:59.
11:59.
Okay.
So
My point is the 5 p.m. deadline is not.
Gone, unless somebody puts, let me just do a
I
caveat,
wanna
if you
repeat
put
the
3
question.
business days.
I want to repeat the question for online. And the question was about time and have we gotten rid of the 5 p.m. deadline? And the answer is yes. Every time period under this contract is 11:59 p.m.
Unless somebody writes business
Business
day in the time period.
But
Like, let's say you
contract.
put it, you put business day in there, then that's 5 p.m. and where the property is located.
Okay, in the back, there was a question. Jessica, you had a question?
I have a question on the sale of buyer's property writer to find out when you say to obliterate the third party information, does that include having to obliterate the buyer's agent's info on that contract?
So the question is, on rider B, it says to obliterate the information on the offer or the contract that's been accepted on the buyer's property. Does that mean getting rid of the agent information as well? I don't think it specifically means getting rid of that. It says, if I'm not wrong, it says the price, the buyer information. It doesn't necessarily reference the agent information, but you certainly could if for some reason you don't want that to be known. By doing so, it doesn't negate that it's a contract on the property. So if somebody wanted to, I don't see a problem with that.
So I guess that on the seller side, if that seller's agent wanted to contact that agent and make sure the property seems solid for the sale.
So in case the seller listing agent wanted to contact the agent that sold the buyer's property, that information would be there and able to be reached out and contact. So if they did obliterate, you could still ask them for that. Yes, question.
The question is, on the closing date, I was always taught to write on before. So you're saying don't do that.
No, and you
So
see,
let me repeat the question.
okay,
Yeah.
This one we got to repeat so online people can hear it. Should you ever use on or before when you put the closing date? So Julie can start and then I'll answer too.
okay. From an attorney standpoint, no, you should not, okay? Because on or before really doesn't accomplish anything, okay? It still takes both buyer and seller to agree to an earlier closing date. So what have you accomplished by using on or before? Nothing. You still have to do an addendum to change the closing date, because I get this all the time. And, you know, so that's why I say on or before. Also, now that we did away about, you know, what happens if you put on or before December 25th and it falls on a weekend? You go to the next date. No, I think because you put on or before, we go back to Friday. So that creates issues. So do not use, even though I'm guilty, I said on or
So
before.
Julie's answer is excellent. I agree in every part of it. So my answer is not only no, it's hell no. Okay, so if that can communicate the flavor of, you know, how important it is. I always tell people when we do this contract, if we felt on or before was important, it would be pre-printed on or before. The fact that you don't see it pre-printed there should tell you something. We don't want it there. And mostly for the reason Julie said, there's no unilateral. When you put on or before, the buyer goes, okay, I want to move it up 2 days. The seller goes, no, that doesn't work for me. The buyer goes, well, wait a second, it says on or before. Well, you think you have a unilateral right to move it up just because it says on or before? You have to have agreement. So what you did is you created conflict when no conflict needed to be there.
And be careful moving closing dates up, okay? Make sure, because when you move the closing date up by addendum, which you would need to do in that scenario, whether you used on or before, even though hell no, you shouldn't use on or before. If you use that, you still need an addendum to change the closing date. But when you change that closing date, if you don't add any other language, anything tied to that closing date gets moved up too. So 5 days prior to closing now is moved up because you got a new closing date, which could create issues with surveys in this market right now. So you got to be careful. Check with the closing agent, attorney, or title company, and see if they have. And you know, as an attorney agent, I think it's important that people have representation. I either represent the buyer or seller. I don't represent. I know there's some out there. I don't represent both. I represent one or the other. But you know, I'm going to look at that title, and I'm the one that's going to object to that title and send a title objection letter. And as you know, under our contract, you have a 30-day cure period. What happens when you don't have a title objection letter sent by, let's say, an attorney? Where are you in that cure period? So that's an issue.
Other questions? Yes, back over. Go ahead. Go ahead.
1 and 7 where it says buyer shall, upon written request, the seller and broker wholly perform shall satisfy.
Yes.
Are we going to come up with an addendum that, I do a lot of work problematic of making sure the buyer puts something right,
They were never giving credit scores, it was just that's how we do it.
So the question is where it talks about seller in writing requesting information about the buyer's loan, approval, the appraisal, the property related. Are we going to create a form to do that written request? The answer is we have not talked about a form to do that. Could one be created? I'm sure one could, but I will tell you, it's not on the to-do list right now that I'm aware of. We'll see how in time this plays out. But notice, as we talked about, generally comes in the form of an email. So the agent for the seller is going to send an email to the agent for the buyer and say, you know, we're requesting an update on the loan approval. We're requesting an update on the appraisal. We're requesting, since you have loan approval, are there any property related conditions in that approval? So it's going to be a written email that's going to be done, not necessarily a form.
So that's something we could probably put right as part of the counter offer, it's right into the contract or other.
Put it in the counter offer that what, that the,
The seller giving a counter offer back to the buyer saying you agree. Allow the seller, the agent to.
it's already in there. You don't need to do a counter. The question is, do we do a counter offer from the seller and the listing agent saying that you give permission? The permission's already in there. The permission's there. It just means that and the reason that we put that the written request has to be made by the seller, that wasn't in there before. Then the question was, it says that the buyer will keep the seller updated in the old version. Well, what happens if the buyer didn't regularly do updates? Were they now in default of the contract? That was the question. That's the reason that we put in that the seller has to request it in writing. Okay, so because we wanted to make sure that the buyer wasn't in default because they didn't provide it. So it's a simple request. That's all, an email request. Yes.
Can you go over again, so if I'm 160, what is the latest of paying your loan approval? Okay, that's kind of the term and approval. Until the 0.2, which is that the buyer in the day 28, 40 days, 28, can they see, okay, they feel like they don't, nothing is going through, or that they don't feel secure about this stuff, they can choose cancel right there without any communication with the seller, on the lender, cancel and get money back.
So the question is, under paragraph 8B, Romanet small 4, right? That's where you're at. Can the buyer, when they don't feel comfortable with their loan approval, just cancel and get their money back?
Yes.
The answer is yes, they can. If there are conditions that they are not comfortable that they can meet, then yes, they can cancel. That's not what they had before.
But you gotta be careful there. It's not discretionary. That's it. You know, I
They
think
have-
that was mentioned in the Florida Realtors webinar that they gave on this. She emphasized it's not discretionary as far as those.
There has to be legitimate conditions they can't meet. But yes, they can cancel them.
And after using good faith and diligent effort.
Right, and that's part of it.
Yeah, so there's two,
That's
yeah.
what I think we can know, because anybody can now, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and cancel, get my money back.
Yeah, because we actually talked about that as the committee, you know, because some of us on the committee felt like it really should be that you get your loan approval, you, the buyer, get your loan approval and look at your loan approval and make sure you're happy with it, you know, before you give notice. Well, technically, there's nothing in this contract says acceptable to buyer and buyer's sole discretion about the loan approval. You know, if you got the financing amount, the terms and all that, then you got, quote, now you got the appraisal too, loan approval. So it's not a discretion.
But if they can't timely meet the conditions. then
After you're
yes,
using good faith and diligent effort.
Exactly.
Okay, I just want to follow up on that question just real quickly. So in day 20, the buyer doesn't have loan approval yet from their lender and found another house that they want better and decides they don't want to go through with this one. can they cancel on day 20 saying, I don't have loan approval, and not provide something from the lender that says that in writing?
No, they couldn't cancel on day 20 because they have a 30-day loan approval. Now, if the lender turns them down, then yes, they could cancel because the lender says, we cannot approve you. Or if the lender says, we approve you, but there are these conditions, and they go, we can't meet these conditions.
Right.
Again, as Julie said, you've got the element of good faith and diligent effort. So if you are on the other side of the transaction and can show that they didn't use good faith and diligent effort, then they're in fault. So you got to be careful. You can't just manipulate things with this.
So that education for the buyer is.
The whole idea here is, and let's make sure we keep it in the context. The whole idea here is, buyer, you got 30 days to get your stuff together. And at the end of 30 days, if your stuff isn't together, then you have a right to terminate under the finance provision. But if you don't terminate, you're on the hook. So figure out your conditions. If you can't meet them, you get the right to terminate.
And remember, if you stay silent and you don't get, buyer stays silent and doesn't give any notice to seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, then 8A is deemed checked. You have no property related conditions right to be able to get your deposit back.
No protections.
Just like it's cash.
No protections at all.
And let me just point out the reason why behind that, because I've gotten some calls on that. The reason behind that is, why should we reward a silent buyer? Really?
One quick question, if I may, about that, which what we're talking about. When the buyer wants to back out, because the loan approval has not been received, does the buyer have to provide any kind of proof of that fact from the bank or from someone saying, or can he just say, hey, I couldn't get the loan, too bad, give me the money back, I'm out of here?
So the question for those online, does the buyer have to provide any lender notice? The contract doesn't require them to provide that, but if they're going to show that they use good faith and diligent effort, then they're probably going to want to provide that. Contract doesn't require it, but how do you show you use good faith and diligent effort? Hey, I use good faith and diligent effort, I still didn't get approved. Here's evidence of that with the lender turned down. So while it's not required, it's going to be a way to help you show that you use good faith and diligent effort. We are over time. We'll stay and answer any other questions, but thank you all for being here with us. I hope you found something beneficial here. Go out and write some contracts so you can go use this stuff, right? Let's go make some money.